Good evening, everybody, and welcome to what I'm sure will be an interesting and informative discussion about current events that are facing our state and our local communities. My name is Andrew McKeever. I'm the news director at GNAT TV. It'll be my pleasure to serve as your moderator for tonight's discussion. This forum is being sponsored by the Bennington County Republican Party, and we are also grateful to Burn Burton Academy for making the Riley Center available to us for tonight's discussion. I also want to welcome the viewers who may be watching this discussion online or on their television sets later on, as my colleagues from GNAT will be taping it for a later rebroadcast. And that also means for those of you who are here in the audience live tonight, if you didn't get enough of it the first time, you can watch it again and get a second dose. And for those of you who will be watching from afar, we're glad to have you with us as well. Filming public events like this are part of GNAT's core mission of promoting civic engagement and civil dialogue, and you'll be able to find tonight's forum on our station's website, gnattv.org, as well as on your television. Before I introduce our panelists, I just want to take a moment to go over our ground rules, which are a little different from usual. I'm going to ask a question of each specific panelist, and they will have 2 minutes to answer that question. The other three panelists will each get 1 minute to comment or rebut or say what they feel they want to say about that particular question. And then you folks in the audience will get 5 minutes to weigh in as well on that question. You'll have a chance to ask one of the candidates, panelists, something further to follow up. I'd just like to ask you to please sort of keep the questions concise. If you want to target them to a particular panelist, go ahead. If your question is more towards the entire panel, if you wouldn't mind making that clear, that would be probably helpful. So the idea is basically to give you folks a chance to enable you while the question is, sort of fresh in your minds, to comment on it rather than waiting till the end of our program tonight, when we also will have 20 minutes or so for a kind of a freewheeling question and answer session from you folks here in the audience. So there'll be multiple opportunities for you to weigh in and engage on all the questions. There will be 2 mics, I believe, going around. Someone will be able to bring them to you if you raise your hand. If you want to ask a question, if you remember just to hold it about 6 inches or so away from your mouth. You don't have to have it right on top of you. Then we should be good. Okay, so hopefully that means we're going to have time for 2 complete cycles through the panel. In other words, about 8 questions altogether. Then we'll go to our question and answer period, and we'll finish up with closing statements from each one of the panelists. Oh yes, one last thing. Please remember to put your cell phones on stun or silence them, whatever. Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel. I'm sure many of you already are well familiar with all of them, but for those of you who may not know all the panelists, starting on what would be your left, we have Cynthia Browning, who is a representative for the district that includes Manchester, Arlington, Sandgate, and most of Sunderland. She was first elected to the state legislature in 2006 and has been serving ever since. She's in the middle of her 5th term right now. When she's not in the legislature representing the district, she is the executive director of the Battenkill Watershed Alliance. She earned a bachelor's degree from Bennington College in 1979 and a PhD from the University of Michigan in 1989. She's also a member of the Arlington Select Board, the Arlington Zoning Board of Adjustment, and the Bennington Regional Transportation Advisory Committee. She also taught economics at Bates College and Williams College, and is a Democrat. Her seatmate, I guess, if you will, is Brian Keefe, who is next to Cynthia. Representative Keith won election to the legislature last year and is in his 1st term. He attended the Loyola University in New Orleans, where he earned a bachelor's degree in mathematics, and after college went to work for Senator Jim Jeffords as a legislative aide for the senator, both in Washington and back here in Vermont. He was the primary staff for Senator Jeffords for the Lake Champlain Special Designation Act of 1989 and the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, among other bills and laws. After 5 years in Washington, he moved back to Vermont to serve as a legislative liaison for Senator Jeffords for another decade, then moved on to work for the Central Vermont Public Service Corporation as the Vice President for Government and Public Affairs, a position he held for 6 years until the company was sold to Green Mountain Power. And since then, he has worked as a consultant in the energy field. He has lived in Manchester for 26 years and is a former chair of the Planning Commission, as well as a former board member of the Manchester Community Food Cupboard. Next, we have Linda Joy Sullivan, who is a representative of the district that includes Dorset, Danby, Mount Tabor, Peru, and Landgrove. She, too, won election for the first time last year in 2016, is a resident of Dorset, and a certified public accountant licensed in Vermont, New York, and Florida, and operates a registered accounting firm. She is also the co-founder, board chair, and former executive director of a nonprofit organization that has served over 3,000 victims of human trafficking around the United States. She was a justice of the peace and a member of the Board of Civil Authorities in Dorset prior to running for the House seat. She has also served on and was the chair of the Jurisdiction Committee of the Vermont Council for Children and Family Prevention Programs. She earned a BA in psychology from New School University and an MBA from the New York Institute of Technology and a law degree from the Thomas Jefferson Law School, where she obtained a certificate of expertise in U.S. taxation. So, perhaps a question on taxes might be appropriate at some point in the evening. And last but hardly least, we have Chief Michael Hall, who many of you know is the Chief of Police here in Manchester. Hopefully you haven't met him on the wrong end of the flashlight some dark night. But Mike was born in Manchester and attended Sunderland schools and Burton before going on to attend classes at Castleton College. He started his career in law enforcement in 1980 and started with the Manchester Police Department in 1983. He has been the Chief of Police since November of 2011. So, without any further ado, let's get right into some questions here and get the show on the road. So, Representative Browning, you're up first. And your first question, what kind of tax reform is needed for the Vermont State Tax Code and why? How could such reforms contribute to a better environment for economic development? You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Yes, I do believe that the Vermont State Tax Code needs reform desperately. It needs reform so that we can have low and stable tax rates, which are the best for businesses, and we can have tax rates that raise sufficient revenue to cover the costs of the functions of state government. The problem with our tax code is that many special provisions have crept into it that give credits, deductions, or exemptions to particular groups of taxpayers, often for very valid policy reasons. But there are so many special treatments that you end up losing a lot of revenue, and you're not always tracking the cost of those provisions or whether they're even effective at achieving the policy goals. So it's become almost like a shadow budget. So I think what we need to do is to eliminate many of these special treatments and reduce the rates, reduce the tax liabilities, target credits at the taxpayers that really need assistance. And I think if you went through that kind of process, you would end up with a simple, effective, reasonable tax code. But it's even more complicated than that, particularly with things like the property tax. Because what's happened with the property tax is that the education fund is a fund where you set the budget first and then you set the tax rate to cover that budget. With most taxes, you set the tax rate and then you have to live within whatever revenue you get. So what has happened is that more and more different kinds of policy programs have ended up in the education fund, even though they're not education, with the result that's one of the reasons why your property taxes are so high. So one of the ways that I would want to reform the Vermont tax code is actually embodied in a bill I introduced, H538, where I try to purify the education fund, lower the spending by like $200 million, reduce residential property tax rates, reduce non-residential property tax rates, and shift the burden of providing support for housing and farmers to the general fund and the income tax. So that sounds really good, and purifying things sounds good, but eliminating special provisions is always good as long as it's somebody else's special tax provision. But my idea is that if you're really serious about tax reform, you have to get rid of them all at once and lower the rates and have a simpler, fairer, and more effective tax code. So that's the approach that I would take to reforming the tax code.
Thank you, Cynthia. All right, Brian, you have a minute to comment.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Thanks to GNAT for sponsoring this. Thanks for everyone for coming out tonight. I think in general, federal or state tax policy should be as stable as possible. But what we're seeing in Washington right now is some big talk of changes, and I think one of the challenges is going to be to accommodate those changes if they occur, for better or for worse. And there's a lot of rhetoric going back and forth on what those changes are. But in general, it looks like rates might come down, the standard deduction might be doubled, and the child care credit might be increased, which I think are good things for a lot of working Vermonters. How that affects, because we're coupled with the federal, how that affects our state revenues is something we're going to have to look at. Meanwhile, there's talk of limiting the state and local tax deduction on your federal form, and that might hit people the other way. It's all up in the air right now. Property taxes, I think, are a mess. It was my first year up there, and I was astounded when we started talking about property taxes and the yields and the rates, how few legislators could really explain what certain changes meant to people back home. The question was, how do I explain this to my constituents? And it was a very hard discussion. So that needs to be simplified.
Thank you, Brian. Linda Joy.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everybody, for coming, and to my colleagues. I will agree with Cynthia Browning on the issue of tax reform, that we do need to have tax reform. I believe that the economy has changed, and the current revenue structure has actually failed to keep up with the changes. The conventional thinking that's out there right now is that we have to raise taxes or we have to cut spending to actually address the annual pitfalls or shortfalls. The bottom line is that our state's economy has gradually changed over the past several decades, and we need to pay attention to that, but the revenue has not kept pace with that. I do know that the thought process right now from partners out there and other legislatures are to form a coalition to do an analysis and to speak with key legislators and key leaders to see whether or not we can come up with an alternate structure. The climate for that is that they're looking forward to 2019 to actually come up with some type of a program and a study group.
Okay. Chief Hall.
Well, as you can tell, I'm not a politician, but I don't have a lot of experience in this particular field. But what I do know is that Vermont, as a person that's born and raised here, I just think that our whole entire state is too reliant upon property taxes in and of itself. And the bulk of the cost of the state operations seems to be laid on the backs of the property owners. If you don't own property in Vermont and you're a renter, you get a rebate, a renter's rebate. I don't know how that makes sense, but the thing I do know is that when I see people that have worked and struggled their entire lives to own a home, that essentially have to put it up and sell it because they can't afford the property taxes and the upkeep on it, signals to me that something is incredibly wrong. So I would encourage the legislature to take a look at other funding sources. We started out with Act 60 back when I was on the school board a number of years ago. They didn't understand that when they implemented it, no more than I think they understand Act 46. And this is not a time for a social experiment when it comes to that sort of thing. So I think it's time that maybe we look at some other, maybe they have to increase the state sales tax or whatever. I don't know, but they can't keep going back to the property owner looking as a source for these revenues.
Thank you, Chief. Okay, now it's your turn. You folks in the audience have 5 minutes to ask a question or make a comment or offer us your input. I believe there are some microphones circulating around, so if you don't have any questions, that's okay too. We can move on to the next one, but it looks like Bradley Meyerson has a question to share with us.
Brad Meyerson. Like Chief Hall, I'm far from an expert in taxation, but I do have a specific question about, there was a rebate, a corporate tax rebate or refund that was paid of $136 million, which made the news as a factor in increasing the state's deficit in this current fiscal year. My question for the legislators is, can you explain that rebate? Was it one paid rebate to one corporation, or was it to a number of corporations? What can you tell us about the source of that rebate, and what? I'm baffled as a taxpayer that a rebate of that size at a time when the state is facing a deficit had to be paid.
I'll give it a shot. I share some of your bemusement about this issue. My recollection was not 136, it was less than that, but my understanding is that there were changes in corporate taxes and deductions, credits, and it all had to be like sort of washed out over a period of time, and the refunds were not provided in a timely way as fast as you would have thought, so they sort of stacked up. And so this big payout kept moving along through the fiscal years, and so one fiscal year went better than people thought because they didn't have to pay those refunds. And then finally they're having to be paid out, I think in the current fiscal year. I don't know if either of you know better than I do. And so it is hitting the state's bottom line because you're expecting a certain amount of corporate tax revenue and you have this reduction. So it was something having to do with the way they calculate corporate taxes, some rebates, credits, adjustments, and it took a long time for it to play out. But I think it's very disturbing, and it highlights the fact that it would be better to just have a simple basic rates situation so you don't get into all this complexity where some corporations get it, some don't, and this kind of special treatment and complexity which creates problems for revenue, creates problems for corporations that are trying to get their refunds, and creates problems for companies that don't get it. And I'm sorry I can't do better than that, but I think you're right that that is a sign of something screwy going on.
Yeah, I'll just comment, Brad, that's a good question. I recall, similar to what Cynthia said, a timing thing, and I didn't think it was of that magnitude, but I will take a closer look.
Looks like we had a hand raised down here near the front.
Thank you very much. The question I have has to do with encouraging businesses to locate in Vermont. Cynthia spoke about redoing the tax code. I'd like to know what presently in the code encourages businesses to come to Vermont. And secondly, does anyone on the panel know of any businesses or corporations, large corporations, who've looked at Vermont and have told the governor or any of our legislators that they're not locating here because of the regulatory activity or the rules and, or the lack of tax credits? Thank you.
I'll give that a shot. I think that my impression is that although there are certain kinds of development tax credits, downtown tax credits, and other kinds of credits that certain businesses can get, there's something called Vermont Economic Growth Incentives, which are tax credits you can get if you expand your business or you bring your business here and expand your business, but you only get those after you've created the jobs. I think that one of the problems with our economic growth development policies has been it's dependent a little bit on giving special tax treatment, but more on giving special subsidies. There actually was a slush fund under the previous administration that the governor could hand out to companies to get them to stay here or to get them to come here. And I really have a problem with that, because if somebody is going to respond to that kind of incentive, as soon as they're offered more, they'll leave. And it ignores all the businesses that are here already. I think the best way to attract new businesses and to grow the businesses that are here are to provide low and stable tax rates and the investments in infrastructure that they need. And then they will see business opportunities, they will expand if they're already here, and they'll come if they're not. But special handouts, although it may get one or two businesses, I don't think that's the way to go. I don't think it's effective, and I don't think it's fair. I actually don't have good anecdotes about businesses that I know for sure have said what you just said to administration. I do know various businesses that have felt they did not have the facilities they needed. I think C&S Warehouse down in Brattleboro ended up going someplace else. But I think that had to do with regulation more than taxes in that circumstances.
If we don't have economic growth, we won't increase our tax base, which the chief pointed out was so important.
Right.
We cannot run the state on property taxes. We cannot do it anymore.
Right.
We have a stable population of 600,000, and all I hear all the time from our wonderful politicians is they keep squeezing us for more taxes because the population hasn't grown. And we can't grow the population unless we have businesses come in here and hire people. I've taught part-time at one of the local universities, and I always ask my students, are they going to stay in Vermont? They all leave. They don't stay here. So somehow there's got to be a comprehensive program. Cynthia suggests tax reform, which is crucial. The chief points out that we can't just depend on property taxes, which is so.
Sir, I'm going to have to stop you right there.
It's such a perfect
But you may have an opportunity to
And
continue
so
with that.
I just hope the panel will.
We're going to have to move on to
But I
continue.
hope they
But
answer that question.
and also, just one other note: if you do have a question, you should wait until the microphone arrives, okay, before you start asking the question. Otherwise, no one's going to hear you. Okay, on to question number 2. This goes to Representative Keefe. Given that Vermont's workforce isn't growing very much, what steps can the state and communities take to retain more young people and attract more skilled workers to the state? 2 minutes.
And I think that's essentially what this last gentleman was getting at, is what should we be doing as a state? And I think it's clear there's no silver bullet, but at the very least, we need to control spending and control the tax increases that we've suffered through the last, thankfully this legislative session, we got through with a balanced budget without new taxes, but that hadn't been the history, and I hope we can do better. It's a little frustrating sometimes that here in Bennington County, you watch the Albany news stations and you see about all these advertisements about these big economic incentive programs that the state of New York has, incubators and tax credits and such. We can't compete with that for the reasons Cynthia gets at, and we're a small state. But we can do things to try to encourage our young people to stay here by showing them there are ways to make a living here without having to go to college or without having to leave. And I think the governor started a new initiative with working with the trade, with the trades and our technical schools, our high schools, our state college systems, our businesses, partnerships, internships, mentoring. I think we can, demographically, we're challenged in these trades. I hear it a lot from people who are in the business and they can't find workers. And meanwhile, our young people are leaving. Well, these are some great jobs. There's a lot of people around this area that have made a good living in the trades, and I think that's an opportunity. We have to go where our strengths are, and that may be one of them. And seize opportunities. We had the ITV Fest here in Manchester about a month ago, the Independent Television Festival, and there were, I don't know, 1,000 or 1,200 people that came from Los Angeles and New York and Brooklyn, and these are demographically a lot different than what we look like here in this room, and these are the demographics we want. We want to, so the question for the people there that were here as TV producers and writers and actors was, what would it take for you to come to Vermont and do your filming here and living here and buying a home here and raising your kids here, paying taxes here? And so Governor Scott spent an hour sitting around a table with these people, quite influential people in the television film business, and he asked, what would it take for you guys to come here? And surprisingly, it wasn't money. It wasn't the type of handouts that Cynthia is rightly critical of. And it was more about the quality of life. It's about people that can work here with them so they don't have to bring all the people with them. It's about equipment being here. It's about facilities like GNAT that has technologies, the Weston Playhouse with a brand new sound stage. So there's certain pieces in its workforce training that can help in a targeted way entice businesses and entice industries to come here and grow.
Thank you, Brian. So, Alinda Joy, 1 minute to comment.
Okay, so I totally agree, and to your points that you brought up, I think that we need to increase the economic opportunities for both the young and the aging. We need industry in Vermont that is more prone towards clean manufacturing, and we need to bring in new businesses. Just cutting taxes is not going to happen. It's just inevitable that we need to develop business growth. We have to brand, we have to target, we have to invest funds in that marketing of bringing business in. We have to look at, as the governor has, aeronautic industries, manufacturing. We have to tap into our resources for our close proximity to New York, to Boston, to Vermont. We need to rebrand, and the onus is on us. I mean, it's going to be what we make it. So just cutting taxes is never going to happen, because if we don't have a flood of revenue stream coming in to revitalize the economy, we will have nothing to cut. So the revenue stream has to come from outside sources. We have to focus on our millennials. They are tapped in with great leadership skills, and they come in with talent. We need to also stop thinking about only up north in the Burlington-Chittenden area. We have to look at what's going on down here, because we are small businesses and we need to tap into a lot of the manufacturing, which will throw the economy, funds back into the economy here in retail and other areas. And we need to partner with schools outside of Vermont and bring hubs down into the south.
Thank you, Representative Sullivan. All right, Chief Hall.
Well, I have a little different spin on that. I talk to a lot of contractors, manufacturing people, and of every walk and every size and dimension that you can think of. And quite honestly, I think the economy in Vermont could be a lot better if the businesses and the factories that operate in this state could hire people. It's not so much about an issue of qualified or trained people. It's about getting people to work. If you talk to any manufacturing or contractor around here, they'll tell you they can't hire people. Well, it's not because there's not people around. There are plenty of people that are around that should be working, that aren't working, that are on state subsidies, social welfare, and they're bleeding our system dry. And not only are you paying these folks, they're not helping the guy out down the road that's running a plumbing business that could do more work if he could get the employer or employees to help him. And don't take my word for it. I challenge you, go out and talk to any business person and ask them if they have a full staff and complement of help, and they're going to tell you they don't. After you talk to them, drive around Rutland or Bennington 4 o'clock, 3:30, 10 o'clock in the morning, and look at the number of able-bodied young men and women that are just loafing around town. You've made it too comfortable for these folks to want to go out and get a job. And that a lot of people don't want to hear that, but it's the truth. And to close it out, I just ask you, when is the last time you heard of anyone in Vermont being charged with welfare fraud? Think about that. Doesn't happen.
Thank you, Chief. Representative Browning.
I think the previous speakers have made a number of useful points. I do want to point out that in addition to what Chief Hall brought up, it's my understanding that sometimes potential workers have trouble passing the drug test. And so that is a whole other issue. They might have skills, but they can't pass drug tests to run heavy machinery and things like that. But I think the question of the unequal levels of development and activity in the state are really important, because 20 years ago, the same pattern of which counties have low unemployment and which have high unemployment was in place then as it is now. Burlington, Chittenden County had low unemployment, the Upper Valley low, the Northeast Kingdom high, Rutland high, Bennington high. 20 years, the same pattern. So when you look at that, our economic development strategies have not succeeded in evening out that unequal development, and it means that not only do the rural and the small town areas suffer a burden, even the developing areas suffer a burden because they have to support these other areas. So I really think we need to have a rural and small town economic development strategy, and in addition to the things already mentioned, I think we need to focus on doing some of the basics really, really well. Transportation, telecommunications, there are still places that do not have service, and water and sewer infrastructure, in addition to the investments in education. And then I think gradually you'd see some of the slow-growing areas recover and grow in an organic, community-based way. But it's not going to be easy, and anybody who says there's a magic bullet is probably wrong.
Thank you, Representative Browning. So again, we turn to you folks in the audience. You have 5 minutes to question the panelists on that question about Vermont's workforce and bringing more young people to the state.
Thank you. Just a comment initially about what I'll call workfare. I think if you're going to have a state where everyone feels that they're valued and they're treated fairly, that yes, you do have to address the issue that Chief Hall has raised, which is workfare becomes a way of saying all of the people who live in Vermont participate in the economy of Vermont. So I hope, if there's not statewide consideration of that now, that there will be, of looking at some sort of workfare system. But I want to go really to the issue of economic development. You folks have mentioned such a wide range of issues to focus on how do we develop the economy of Vermont. But how do we find, as someone said earlier, what is our place that makes us unique? What do we market Vermont as? So is there any statewide initiative? Does the governor have a commission? Is there a legislative committee that is focusing on how do we sell Vermont? Every state that, it can be New York, it can be New Jersey, it can be, pick California. They have differentiated themselves in the marketplace. So while I heard a lot of different ideas, we can't do them all. How do we sell Vermont? Whether it's technology, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's whatever it is there a statewide initiative?
Representative Sullivan?
Sure, I'll start. The governor has taken an initiative to start a campaign, but the funds that have been provided for that initiative are very modest. And so while I think it's called Think Vermont, and there is a website that's up, and there was an ask for more funds to be put into the branding and targeting of businesses. So they are starting that. More money is needed to do that. So when we go back to the legislature in the following years or for the years going forward, we are going to have to bite the bullet and say money has to go to brand Vermont. You have to put money into the branding if you want to bring money in. And that's a tough call. So where does the money come from? We have to get partnerships out there with other businesses. We also have to use caution, because while we have Act 250 out there, and it was supposed to be structured so that good businesses would come in and they would pay attention to, of course, air quality and water issues. Now it has become the thought that Vermont is anti-business, and we need to rebrand and change that, and we need to assist with the Act 250 restructure to make it more prone for businesses to come in.
So we have one hand there in the aisle. Bob?
Is it on? Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi, I would just like to say that I think Vermont sells itself very well. I moved here full-time in June. It's a beautiful state. I'm thrilled to be here, having left our nation's capital. But I think Chief Hall is spot on in the sense that I've just spent 9 months redoing a house. Can't get electricians, can't get plumbers, can't get carpenters. There's a real issue in the labor force up here. So I don't know how, Ms. Sullivan, you're going to get aerospace up here when we can't find people to wire houses. But I would, my focus is on the social benefits programs, and I wonder, simple question, if any of the 3 elected politicians on the stage have made any effort to scale back the social welfare programs in the state of Vermont.
I think I saw another hand. Was that you, Ralph?
Wait a minute. Shouldn't we address his question?
Okay, would you like to respond to it?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. I think that there have been efforts in the legislature to try to reform social benefit programs, whether it's family assistance, children's assistance. There's something called Reach Up that tries to get families out of poverty, or assistance for seniors to live at home. There's a wide variety of social benefit programs. There have been periodic efforts to try to make them more efficient, more effective, perform better, better bang for the buck. It's very, very difficult. But I have voted, until this past year, I voted against the state budget multiple times because I felt that spending was growing out of control, including spending on the benefits programs. So I think we need to coordinate them. We need to have a one-stop shopping where someone applies and then they qualify for different benefits. I am not convinced that we are doing the programs that we need to do properly, and I think we may be doing some things that we don't need to do. But it's very, very difficult after you've established the benefit program to try to reduce it or take it away. But I have voted against the budget because that was one of the components in spending that was growing too quickly. So I can offer you that, but I can't point to any particular program that I tried to cut. I think that making it easier for people to apply and easier to track their benefits in order to catch fraud and abuse would be really important. And the state has had a lot of trouble with its IT systems and trying to do that kind of benefit tracking. But I think that should be part of having an effective state government going forward.
Okay, thank you, Cynthia. Ralph, I'm going to have to ask you to hold your question, and I'm sure you'll have an opportunity again to share it with us. But now we're going to have to move on to our third question for Representative Sullivan. And your question, Representative, is what is the current situation in terms of ongoing increases in the minimum wage already in process? What are the pros and cons of any mandated increases?
So Title 21 pretty much controls where the laws on labor go, and the Vermont minimum wage has been raised before, and it was done in a 3-step process. So it started out at $9.60 in 2016 and went to $10 in 2017, and then is expected to hit $10.50 in 2018. And that's based on a full-time worker for 30 hours a week. So right now, there are proposals to increase it to $15 an hour, and several bills have been out there, and some of the time frames are 2020, and there's been a study that's been going on. It hasn't been completely public, but the concept right now is that it should hit 2028 for the $15 to come out. But when, I'm sure Representative Keefe will jump in after. As far as the pros and cons, with more, there will be more disposable income. If there was an increase, that would lead to more spending. That goes back into the economy. The cons, there will be a burden on employers, potential job loss, and there will be a deterrence of business from coming into the state of Vermont, depending upon if somebody thinks they can't afford that because of the matching process. So will it actually lead to job loss? There's a possibility is that it could lead to job loss, but once again, that depends upon the area. Our area is small business except for tourism and the hotels. So we may have a job loss that happens. I think whatever we do, if we're going to set ceilings, we really need to be prepared to deal with the consequences, because that's what's going to happen. Whatever mandate we throw out there, we have to live with it. I think that the businesses have social responsibilities, and I think they own up to it. They partner with the government, they pay taxes, and from those taxes, they help with income and they help with safety nets and programs. So we have to think about what we have here, and once again, I go back to what was brought up. We have to market, we have to target, we have to bring new businesses in order to keep the wage going. Right now, to live or get an apartment for somebody, they need $21. They need $45,000. So we're always going to have a benefit cliff. It's not going to go away unless we make some changes and bring in bigger businesses and more opportunity.
Thank you, Representative Sullivan. All right, Chief Hall. You have 1 minute.
Oh, okay. Well, let me just get my train of thought here. Can I go back to a previous question?
Sure, okay.
Okay. The question was asked about the benefit reform. The Agency of Human Services in the state of Vermont does not cooperate with law enforcement when it comes to investigating welfare fraud. A number of years ago, we did a roundup, some of you may have been around at the time, of drug users and dealers in Bennington County. The arrest numbers were somewhere around 60 people. Out of that 60-some people, over 50 were Vermont residents. Out of that 50-some people, I think 49 or something like that were on some sort of social assistance. The state's attorney's office was willing to try to prosecute those people for welfare fraud, because obviously if you're a drug dealer, you shouldn't be on welfare. And couldn't get the cooperation. That information, if I were to call up and try to conduct an investigation on someone I suspected of committing welfare fraud, they would tell me that information is confidential, that I'd need a subpoena to do it. That is ridiculous. If I had somebody working in the town of Manchester stealing from a taxpayer that worked for the town of Manchester, I could investigate that crime, and they're stealing from the public, they'd be arrested. There's no need for these roadblocks to be set up. Unfortunately, what you have a lot of people now that are migrating to Vermont because it's my understanding under the Clinton era, 5 years on the welfare, we're going to educate you, we're going to train you, we're going to give you the opportunity to get off welfare. 5 years to do it. Once that 5 years come up, you have to go off. Well, guess what? Vermont took that 5 years and said, okay, now the feds aren't paying for it. We're going to add it onto our payroll, and we'll derive that money through your taxes, and we'll allow these people to stay on the system. The public is not getting a straight story from the government when it comes to these social programs. And like I said, show me one person that's been charged with welfare fraud in the state of Vermont over the last few years. It doesn't happen.
Thank you,
You know
Chief.
what? They don't care.
I have to cut you off there. Sorry. I'm sure you'll have a chance to come back to this later. Okay, so the original question was the current situation of ongoing increases in minimum wage already in process and the pros and cons. Cynthia, you have 1 minute or so to comment.
Okay, I guess I just wanted to back up a little bit in terms of what Representative Sullivan was saying. In 2014, the minimum wage was $8.73 an hour, then it went to $9.15, then it went to $9.60, 2016, and then $10 to 2017. Will go up again in 2018, and then after that, already in statute, it will be adjusted for inflation automatically. So it's very important to understand that there's already a process in place to have some increases in the minimum wage. To me, I'm not willing to consider proposals of additional increases until we see how what we've already put in place plays out. In addition, I think the most effective thing would be for the incentives of workers and management to be more closely aligned, and for investments to be made by both that increase the productivity of workers and then they share increased revenue, rather than trying to force increased wages when that cost just comes out of the business pocket. So the worker may have more money to spend, but the businessman has less money to spend. So I think we should be very cautious, because I think that if we try to go further than we've already gone, remember, we're already doing it, people who we're trying to help will lose benefits and end up no better off, and we are going to lose jobs and lose businesses. So I support the process that was already put in place of continuing modest, slow increase, but I'm not willing to consider big jumps at this time.
Thank you, Representative Browning. Representative Keefe.
So this is a big question. It's going to be a big debate this upcoming session, I believe. I was appointed to a minimum wage study committee that we're about to conclude the report. There's no surprises, because the question going in was, does it help low-income workers or does it harm business? And it does both, and Cynthia just explained some of that. But in particular, here in Bennington County, some of the businesses are some of our important social service industries, child care providers, adult daycare providers, visiting nurses. And I've met with people from each of those sectors, and of course they all say, yes, we want our employees to be paid more, we want our work to be valued more, but going to a $15 wage would be crushing either to our customers, or in some cases it's a reimbursement from the federal government or the state government, and it just doesn't work for these important social services. So before we jump into raising a minimum wage to $15, we have to really understand how it might affect a lot of the programs and businesses around here that really could be harmed by such a jump.
Thank you, Representative Keefe. Okay, back to you folks again for 5 minutes of audience questions. And Ralph Colin, I apologize for cutting you off there earlier, but here's your second chance.
I won't cut you off. What we're talking about here really, in essence, because all of these questions have been addressing it one way or the other, is economic development. Let me just mention a few things with which I've had some personal experience here. When I served back in 1999 till 2002 as Dorset's representative, or one of the two representatives, to the Bennington County Regional Commission, what we found was that with all the promises of interest in developing the economy in this state, it was a lot of language without any backward. And I was the representative to the Vermont Economic Progress Council at that time from the Bennington County Industrial Commission. Among other things, and the Economic Progress Commission was started in Howard Dean's day, but they didn't do much until Jim Douglas came in 2002. And what they were there for was to provide some kind of tax incentives to new businesses or businesses that were here and wanted to expand in order to attract them either to enter the state or to remain here. It was a great idea which no one apparently believed in. They did it because we have to compete with New York, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts to bring businesses here or to let them expand and grow. But there were a lot of people in the legislature who paid lip service to that and had no desire to actually incentivize businesses to stay or to expand. And so they put in something called the but-for clause in the rules that said, we won't give you any money unless you can prove that if you didn't have the money that you're asking for, you couldn't expand or you couldn't come to Vermont.
Excuse me, Ralph, what exactly is the question you want to pose?
Well, I'm saying that we're talking about economic progress, but the state really doesn't want economic progress. They say they do and they don't. When I was on the Act 250 Commission for Bennington County, the District 8, the regulations that are put in there to essentially block people from coming into the state and buying or establishing businesses here it can take years and years and expenditures that go beyond the ability of many small businesses to establish themselves here. And so many of them give up and say there's no probability that we are going to know one way or the other for many years whether or not we're going to be able to build a new building or expand our business one way or the other. We've got those problems, in addition to which this is an expensive state for anyone in which to live. Affordable housing almost doesn't exist in this state. And you can't expect people to come in with people who work for them and be able to afford to live here. So that's another area that I think that the state government really doesn't pay that much attention to. In other words, we've got things that are going against economic development, despite the fact that the state says that it wants to develop economically.
Well, we have about a minute left if someone wants to take a stab at responding. I see two hands up. Cynthia?
I guess I think you just covered a huge amount of material and ground. I think that people do want economic development, but you rightly pointed out that people have different ideas of what they want and what kind of development they want. I think that the affordable housing issue, you may be interested that a nonprofit organization is going to be issuing bonds. I think the state it was $35 million of bonds to construct affordable housing. The key issue is that it not all be in Chittenden County, and that's one of my key issues. So there is an awareness of that issue. I'm not convinced that this initiative in and of itself is going to solve that problem, but people are noting about that. I think that the question of regulation and Act 250 and how do we protect our environment while encouraging sustainable development is one that Representative Sullivan already referred to and is very, very important. I actually still do not believe that special handouts to particular industries is the best way to go. I think it's better to have conditions that favor economic activity for everybody, but that's harder and that's more expensive, but I think it will be more long-lasting than using the money on handouts, even though it may look as if you're getting a couple of companies to come. And if we compete with our strengths, with the ways that we're unique, we're different from the other states, I think that is the path that we need to go on.
Okay, we'll have to leave it at that for now, but I'm sure you'll have a chance to kind of comment on that at a later juncture. Okay. But now it's time to go on to Chief Hall for a question. And Chief, if recreational marijuana is legalized, how can highway safety be ensured and how can driver impairment be measured?
Well, one of the things that the governor has talked about and some of the folks insofar as the recreational marijuana legalization initiative has been that we're going to train more police officers to be drug recognition experts. And there's about 1,600 full-time law enforcement officers in the state. If they trained up to the last class, we must be somewhere in the vicinity of 100 drug recognition experts. That is wholly inadequate if you're talking about introducing a recreational drug into the mainstream of the motorist population. And I'll give you an example. If we stop a person that we believe is operating under the influence of drugs, we have to call out a drug recognition expert. That's going to be one of these 100 people throughout the state. They may be on day off, they may be on a shift off, they may be on vacation, they may be working. That officer would come out, do an assessment based upon his or her training, along with the other factors observed by the officer. They could proceed to process that person for driving under the influence of drugs. The issue that I have with that is that, think about this, if we had to call out an expert for alcohol, an alcohol recognition expert, every time a police officer suspected someone was driving under the influence of alcohol. I mean, can you imagine that? What's going to happen is the demand's going to be there, and what do you do if you don't have a person? And we've had that happen where you don't have an expert available to come out and do that roadside analysis. Do you let the person go? Well, if you let them go and something bad happens, you know where you're going to be with that. You really can't legally detain them. So it raises a whole nother issue about public safety. You know, the degree of impairment through the amount of nanograms of THC that's in the system. Colorado, for example, I believe has a 5 nanogram threshold. Vermont at the present time has any amount. Well, the question then comes, where does Vermont fall into that picture? Are they going to stay with any amount or whatever? As far as how you're going to gauge your success in this, I don't know. How would you gauge that? Perhaps after you've got some data that you can pull upon for years of car accidents and fatal accident investigations, you can make a determination as to what's going on with that. But I'm not quite sure how you would measure that from this point. What I will tell you is that we have made significant strides in DUI enforcement over the years. It's pretty rare now that you get people that are severely impaired to the degree that they were 10 or 15, 20 years ago. And I think overall safety has increased. But there again, you look at the statistics here in Vermont, we're on the uptick for fatalities this year. So, you know, if we don't have an answer for that, is it impaired driving? Is it distracted driving with people texting and cell phoning or whatever? There's a lot more that needs to be looked into before we just legalize recreational marijuana, because we're not prepared for it. Law enforcement is not prepared to handle the potential onslaught of issues that may bring with it.
Thank you, Chief. Representative Browning, you have a minute to reply.
I just wanted to say that that I have opposed the legalization of recreational marijuana because I don't feel we're ready. We're not ready in terms of protecting young people, and we're not ready in terms of highway safety. But I did try to put an amendment on a bill that was moving in the House that would have said before it can be legalized, we have to have everybody trained. Before, and we have to have a standard. We may not know that it's the right standard, but we have to have a standard. I myself would think if there's any level of THC in your blood and you fail a roadside sobriety test, I think you're impaired. You know, but we need that before we do this. And I think there's such a rush to try to do this, and I understand the reasons why, but you need to protect the people who are not using marijuana, the traveling public, the innocents who may be affected by this. And so we need to make those investments before we go ahead and legalize it. And so I support what the chief was saying.
Okay. Representative Keith.
So I think the question was, how do you measure impairment and protect highway safety? And my answer is I don't know. And I think the chief explained some of that. The governor appointed a task force to look into some of these issues, some of the issues that Representative Browning pointed out. So we'll see, I think we'll see those results before the beginning of the session. And I probably have a debate on this subject next session.
Representative Sullivan.
I agree with the measurement. I don't know how to do the measurement. That's not my area of expertise, and I do know that there is a study going on right now. I do know, though, that it's already out in the streets, so hopefully we will pay attention to it and we will see what's going on more quickly, and the governor will be astute in his assessment, and we'll debate it on the floor.
Okay. Back to you folks for comments, questions. Yes. Looks like we have a hand up down in front here.
I'd like to welcome a new editor of our newspaper, if she is here. Does she happen to be here? Oh, she really is. Welcome to the town of Manchester and our neighbors. Now back to some serious business. We're sitting, in my eyes, in one of the problems of America. The same thing is going on in Chicago, California, New Jersey, New York. We're talking about teachers and teachers' pensions. There's going to be an explosion. I think Ralph Colin covered it very, very well, better than I could ever do. But I want to ask Mike, Chief Hall, who I have the most admiration for the work that he does with a handful of men that are dedicated. Without them, America doesn't exist. I would like to see a nice round of applause for Mike. Now I'm going to see if I can burn Mike a little bit by lighting a match on his shoes and see if he can handle the heat. A few weeks ago, we had a conversation, Mike. Could you tell the audience a little bit more about some of the things that are occurring in our delicate town? What I mean by that is some of the weird things that may have we thought were weird, but are not, and are almost every day for you and your force. You just mentioned a few about marijuana. And by the way, I was at Gannett when the lieutenant governor addressed, and I asked him a few questions. The answers I got from him were typical of a politician. He yes and noed and noed and yes and didn't say anything in 10 minutes. I know you're not a BSer, and you've got some good answers. And I know that the three people, when we had our last meeting, Cynthia Browning and LJ, weren't at that meeting, and you told some things. And I'm from North Jersey, and I thought I've seen a lot of things in my short lifetime. And you told us some things that were unbelievable that occurred in our area. Could you relate a few more and tell the audience about some of the lovely things going on around here?
Over to you, Mike.
That's a pretty broad question, but if I recall the context of our conversation, it revolved around some of the things that were taking place in the legislature that I thought were out of place. And some of that was, in my opinion, the separation of powers of the government between the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And with that, what I've seen is a lot of meddling, what I would call meddling by the legislature into the executive branch, where they're getting more and more into policy making, procedural settings, things that aren't supposed to happen based upon my understanding of the Constitution and the way the government's supposed to run. And You know, the reason why we have those 3 divisions of power is so that any one sector of government doesn't have too much control. But when I see that the legislature is mandating the Criminal Justice Training Council to adopt certain policies and procedures, specifically in one case, a fair and impartial policing policy, which is in essence a immigration policy, they're overstepping their bounds. And, you know, we have laws that cover that, and we have federal laws and state laws that cover how we operate as a police agency. And I think that that's the kind of thing that I see happening at the legislative level that most people are not aware of. And perhaps some of the legislators would like to chime in on that. But again, when I see a regulation come out of the legislature that you either adopt this policy or we'll make one for you, that's not how government's supposed to work.
Well, I'm going to have to ask the legislators who maybe want to chime in to hold their chiming for a minute or two, or until we get to a later part of the program, because I think we'll have to keep moving on to our second round of questions now. Back to Representative Browning. And Representative Browning, this question is on balancing the budget. Why does the state struggle to create a balanced budget plan every year and then struggle to meet the terms of that plan? What could be done to improve the process? 2 minutes.
Oh, that's an easy one. Okay, first of all, it's very timely because there have been some news articles talking about that we have a $45 million budget gap already going into the next fiscal year. Well, what that comes from is if the staff sort of projects everything the state's already doing and just says to do exactly what you're doing this year, next year, how much more would it cost with rising costs for materials, rising compensation for state employees, et cetera, et cetera. So they project those costs and then they project revenues and they have a gap. So that's the gap they're talking about. Through a process of struggle and difficulty, we will balance that budget. We will eliminate that gap through some combination of reducing spending, raising tax revenue fees, or one or the other. And we will have a balanced budget plan, which will then evolve during the year, and it may or may not turn out to be a good plan because of unexpected things that happen. So we always have this struggle, and I think it's actually part of a representative form of government because we always want to do more things for our state. We want to invest in branding. We want to invest in more police officers. We want to invest in economic development. So we have all these different needs, but at the same time, we don't want to raise taxes because that's not popular. And so there's a constant tension with that. My feeling is that we need to freeze the cost of certain programs or moderate their growth until tax revenue can catch up to it. But that's only going to happen if there's economic development, and if we have another recession, the revenues will drop. So I do not believe that we have a sustainable budget and taxation system as it stands. I do want to just mention something that came up briefly, which was unfunded pension liabilities. This is a significant problem. It's not as bad in Vermont as it is in other states, but we have promised pensions to state employees and to teachers, and the funds are not fully funded. We have to appropriate money every year just to keep up. We're not catching up. That is a big problem. And that has the potential to crowd out other things in the budget that we want to do. So I think we need to make less generous promises going forward and be more careful about putting programs in place and be more moderate about how they're going to grow over time. And then, of course, we have to do tax reform.
Thank you, Representative Browning. Representative Keefe, 1 minute.
Yeah, I agree with most of that. I think that we apparently have too optimistic of a revenue forecast year after year, and what that leads to is that optimism allows for more spending to come in under the pretext that, well, we're not raising taxes because we're going to have more revenue and that's how we're going to be able to do this, which in a growing economy is the way it should be, but our economy isn't really performing all that well. I think we need to look a lot more carefully at whether we're being too optimistic on those revenue forecasts. And yeah, pensions, I'll just briefly say that is a big, it's still a sleeping issue, but we need to wake up, or we will be woke up to that one.
Representative Sullivan.
So pretty much I think that our revenue side of the formula is easier to calculate. It's the spending side of the budget that is really not as tight and a strict formula, because we get these carry forwards over the years and we just never catch up, and we always keep going forward with spending, and those create pressures to open up more needs and fund more programs. In order for us to have a fully sustainable budget, the key is that our current population needs not be paying for service needs of our future. So we have to make sure that we look at what the actual gap is, and right now it's an artificial number. We really don't know. We can just swing back and forth, and we have to get more detailed information. As far as the unfunded liabilities, at least with the new accounting rule, it's now actually going to be on a balance sheet. It's not a pretty picture, because had it been on the balance sheet prior years, we would have seen that our state wasn't in such a good shape, and that would have hurt our bonds and our deficit liability financing. So we need to pay attention, and we need to look at the state of Vermont, and we need to look at the fiscal responsibility to make sure that we are not using funds just to follow an artificial number. We need to cut.
Thank you, Representative Sullivan. Chief Hall.
I'll pass.
Okay. Very good. Okay. Audience, 5 minutes. Carol.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask the question. I think I've asked this question before. 48% of this state is on some type of funding, welfare, whatever. 48%. My question to you is, my understanding, and I think I've asked people to look into it, when a welfare person moves to this state, the state of New York, I believe, you have to be there a month or 2 months before you can apply for welfare. I believe the state of Vermont has a week residency, and then it's retroactive back to your first day. And I think I've asked that question before, because otherwise this is just a perfect place for everybody to come in the country. And I just think people have to get wise up there, because we can't make all the money down here. So it's something that we have to look at for the government to help us out with.
Does anyone want to make a response to that?
Well, I'll comment briefly. I don't know what the residency rule is for different programs, and there are various different programs. I was assigned to the Human Services Committee last year, and yeah, there's the programs. They try to be coordinated. They try to be streamlined. There is overlap. There are mistakes. Meanwhile, there's a lot of really hard cases out there, and yeah, there's probably people that come here in need and that are in need, and having to figure out the line between helping people who truly are in need and those that are taking advantage of the system is very tough. We can do better. We need to do better. And I'm learning, but I don't know all the particular ins and outs, but there are some very hard cases out there. I know that.
I think that we need to have more results-based accountability from the Agency of Human Services and DCF, and we need to have somebody actually analyze the programs, and they should be able to calculate to the penny how much money they need for the services based upon the people that are out there. So I think that we need to have them held to a higher fiduciary standard, as well. Like, we're held to a higher fiduciary standard. I think it's important that the calculations begin and we find out now exactly what the dollars are that are out there.
Okay. Any other? Okay, I see one. Okay.
Why is it when the entire private sector has gone to defined contribution plans, is the state still on a defined benefit and having pension fund liability issues as opposed to offering 401ks and IRAs?
The state has a defined benefit plan, which means that you have a set benefit that is due to the retiree, and the state has to come up with the funds to cover that benefit. As you say, many private firms have gone to defined contribution, which means that the company puts in the contribution and then you get the benefit that stems from that contribution. The state has not gone to that for the state employees or the teachers because of political resistance from those groups. There have been revisions to those plans that endeavor to modify the cost going forward, but it's usually just going forward because it's seen that everybody that's already vested, you have a binding contract and you can't change it. So, so that's my sort of simple basic take, is that the people that enjoy these benefits have political power and they resist making that transition. And from their perspective, they may be right, and it is true that sometimes the state or teachers are able to attract people because of the nature of the retirement system. You might not get the same quality of employee if you didn't have that retirement system. I personally think we have made promises that we cannot afford to keep, and that is not the right way to do it. You need to fully fund what you're promising from the get-go, otherwise you can't promise that much. But it's easier to say that now when we've already made the mistake. I would be open to modifications in the nature of the retirement plans going forward along those lines, but I have seen no political appetite for doing that, given the power of those organized groups, and I understand why they take that position.
Thank you, Representative Browning. Okay, Representative Keefe, your next question is, what can the state do to guide future growth? Where will Vermont's future growth be? High-paying manufacturing or lower-paying service jobs, do you think?
Well, I hope it's the former more than the latter. I think the higher tech is more attractive than the service, but it's going to be a blend of both. I mean, we see it especially here in Manchester. It's always been, we're a tourist economy, a service-based economy, but those services can really add value. So I wouldn't discard either end. We're going to have to be, we talked about some of this earlier tonight, take advantage of our strengths. I mentioned the ITV Fest, and maybe there's room to grow in the film production industry. Representative Sullivan mentioned the aerospace, which has been a focus of the state. There was a good question about branding. Who do we want to be? And we need to sort those out. I sat last week with a representative of the Vermont Chamber Foundation, and they've got a new initiative to try to derive some data on how the state is performing and where these strengths and weaknesses are, so we can measure ourselves going forward. Sort of similar to the results-based accountability that Linda was just talking about. I don't have an answer to that question. I don't know exactly where we go, but we need to focus on our strengths and take advantage of them and present to our younger people, our high schoolers, our college students, the tourists that come here, our visitors, and we need to make Vermont a better place, a more friendly place to live and work and raise a family. And having a stable tax and budget policy is fundamental to that. But we've touched on all the other challenges, and there are many challenges.
Thank you, Representative Keefe. Representative Sullivan.
So once again, I really believe that Vermont's future is going to be what we make it. I believe that branding and targeting clean manufacturing and green technology is going to be important because that is what Vermont has a nice claim to be. But we have to get the buzz out there that Vermont is business friendly. We need to have goals and we need to have sustainability. I believe that we have some high wealth individuals and businesses that could come here. They come here seasonally. We need to convince them that Vermont is a friendly place to stay. I think it's very important that if we're going to start to tax services, that we do an analysis of the people who decide they want to tax the service industry really need to understand how those service industries work. They need to understand how the money is captured. When does it actually become the money of that specific service industry? So whatever we do, I think we need not to just shoot from the hip and do it. I think we need to pay attention. But the goal, as Representative Keefe says, is we have to bring business to Vermont. And to the question before, Act 250 is a detergent right now because most people can just come and say, hey, I'll be an interested party and I'll sue and I'll delay the business from coming in and I'll tie it up forever. And so we have to stop that and we have to make it a nice place to come for business.
Thank you, Representative Sullivan. Chief Hall.
Well, as a young fellow growing up here in Vermont, I can tell you that Vermont typically has survived on tourism. Back when I was a young boy growing up here in town, almost every business that in town, other than a couple of small manufacturing businesses, all relied upon tourism. And we relied on the folks that were coming up from the city that decided that you could ride down a hill on a couple of wooden slats, and people come up here and they spent a lot of money, and people prospered and did well. The contractors built houses because people liked it here, and they wanted second homes here. There was a time when Vermont was very prosperous, and I think the majority of that prosperity came from the tourism that we had. As a native Vermonter, I can tell you, we've milked this cow for 60 years and never fed it. You know, we reaped the harvest of everyone coming here and spending their money and going to Stratton and Bromley and all those places, but we never put any money back into it. Our state parks are in disrepair. Our very basis that we sell ourselves to our surrounding areas, you know, our Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department is funded by its own sale of licenses, and to my knowledge, has to beg, borrow, and steal to get money from the state of Vermont to operate. Well, you know, if that's the way you're going to run your business, you probably aren't going to be successful. So, you know, I'll be honest with you, I'm pretty optimistic about a lot of stuff, but when you have the highest energy rates in New England that Vermont has and the cost of living here, I'm not so sure you're going to find any major company that's going to want to put a major investment here. So I think we need to just look at what we have, which is a great place to live, a great place to raise a kid, education and whatnot. Take advantage of that. We are a tourist-driven state, a service industry state. And I think all the talk about bringing industry back is nice, but you know, you're going to have to bring a lot of jobs back to Vermont to stabilize that. I think we should expand on our tourism and start putting money in it. And you know, just on a local level, we've got a 1% sales tax that is derived through the businesses in this town, and they've just approached the select board, my understanding, about trying to get at least a portion of that to utilize to advertise and build their business. We'll see where that goes. But
Thank you, Chief. I'm going to stop you there for now. Representative Browning.
Just briefly, I think everybody else has made really good points, but I just think it's important to note that we don't really know how things are going to unfold. I don't think we fully incorporated the digital revolution into the economy. I think it's going to unfold in unexpected ways. I know that we now have things going on that I never would have thought would be happening 20 years ago. I would never have foreseen. Capitalism is a process of creative destruction. Industries grow and swell and then sometimes decline. The key thing is to be sure that the people, the communities the infrastructure, the environment don't also decline, and that we can develop flexible capacities so we can move and shift and learn to do new things as the future unfolds. Because we're building the basis for the next 50 years, the next 60 years. Are we making the right kind of investments? And remember, we don't always know what's coming. So we need to try to make investments that will give us flexibility and adaptability.
Thank you, Representative Browning. So we're going to have two more questions, one on the opioid epidemic and one on how to strengthen local law enforcement. But first, back to you folks for 5 minutes or so of questions on that question we were just talking about now. What can the state do to guide future economic growth? Does anyone have a question or a comment they'd like to lob at one of our panels? It looks like Kathleen James there has her hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Kathleen James from Manchester. Curious to hear you guys address what economic opportunity you see in what I believe is an imperative of climate change mitigation. It seems to me that an exciting and potentially, expansive opportunity for economic growth here in Manchester and around the state would be in climate change mitigation, renewables, green technology. Can you guys address that, please?
I'll take a shot at it. And I do some work in the solar world, so I'll mention that right up front. But, Vermont has a great record on energy efficiency, renewables, and being at the forefront of a lot of those things. We have the energy efficiency charge on your electric bill. It's not always the most popular thing in the world, but that program is very robust in Vermont. We have a gross receipts tax that helps fund some of our weatherization plans. We have at our utility scale, we have a lot of very innovative regulations that encourage or mandate the use of renewable energy. And so around Vermont and around here, you're seeing more solar. You don't see much wind around here, but there's a couple of smaller towers. And yeah, it's a part of Vermont's economy. And I think we should be proud of a lot of the innovation and a lot of the things that we as consumers fund already in this field.
Yeah, I can't remember the figures, but I think there's already a significant level of employment in the green and renewable technology areas, and I think we can build on that. I just think it's important for us not to try to go in directions that cause problems for the environment or for homeowners, so that even as we create new productive assets, we don't want to damage the assets that we already have. And I think it's also important that the push for conservation and efficiency that we are already doing to some extent, maybe not enough, but to some extent, that whether or not someone believes in climate change, conservation and efficiency that economize on energy use, that reduce costs, those are good in and of themselves, and to the extent that they reduce fossil fuel use and can mitigate climate change, even better. So I think it's really important for us to push forward on that common ground of conservation, efficiency, and renewables. I personally prefer small-scale renewables that don't require building new distribution capacity. I'm very cautious about the industrial-scale renewables because I think some of that was pushed a little bit too far too fast. But I think that is definitely something we need to work on going forward as part of economic development. And some corporations may actually be attracted to a state if they know they can get renewable sources of energy. So I think that should be part of our economic development portfolio.
Looks like we have...
I really need to put two things together. Is this on? Yes. Oh, sorry. I think we need to put two things together. It's wonderful, and I'm committed, and we talked about branding and all of those things, to economic development. But are we committed to economic development simply as a tool to sustain the expenses that we already have? Or are we doing economic development because we're investing in the growth, reasonable growth, and I mean growth in a good way. I'm not talking about, lots of buildings and destroying what Vermont is. But I'm troubled by the two not being talked about together. If it is in fact 48% of the people in Vermont, if that's a correct number, are receiving benefits, and we don't know, I mean, is that an increasing trend? Last year, was it 30, and now it's 48? Is it going up? In other words, are we trying to drive our economy, and are we talking about economic growth only to sustain our existing system, in which benefits seems to be a very, very significant part? Or are we looking at economic development as a way to invest in the things that we value in our state? And that's what growth means. So I don't know that there's necessarily an answer, but I needed to put the two together, and I'd appreciate any comments you have. Thank you.
If someone on the panel wants to respond, you have about 30 seconds.
I think they definitely should go together. I think that we should be pursuing economic development as part of our desire to provide the capacity for Vermonters to fully live their lives and have a good life and create opportunity for their children. It isn't just to finance state government. It's just that the state can't make necessary investments if it doesn't have growing economic activity. So it's kind of a circular situation. But I think you make a very good point. In terms of the benefits, I don't know about that figure. I do know that with the expansion of Medicaid, which covered many more people, provided health insurance for them, both before and because of the Affordable Care Act, that means that more Vermonters are receiving that benefit than was true before. And I think for people who did not have health insurance, to have health insurance is fundamentally a good thing, even though we have problems with controlling benefit growth.
Thank you, Representative Browning. Okay, on to our next question, which goes to Representative Sullivan. What additional steps can the state take to combat the opioid epidemic? What more can communities do?
Okay. So there's definitely two concepts out there. There's the governor's program, where you go, and it's the, I think it's a Spoken Hub or Hub and Spoke, where you can go, and if you're in need of a drug to get you through till you get your next prescription, you can go there. I personally am more inclined to monitor and regulate the prescribers. I personally believe that we need to have a cause of action in place, that process where if there is a direct overwriting of prescriptions by unqualified people or even by qualified licensed people, that we need to put in place the regulations. Right now, we have guidelines that are out there. I am actually going to be presenting a bill where we take some of those guidelines and we incorporate them into statute. So I think the key right now is that we have to make sure that the people who are prescribing are held to that higher level because they should have licenses. I believe that there should be a monitoring of those licenses, or that they should not overprescribe. And if they do, they need to be held accountable for it. As far as the community is concerned, I think that the community is going to participate once the laws go through. I mean, I think the community is trying to follow the laws, and if people are able to prescribe, then they're entitled to it.
Okay, thank you, Representative Sullivan. Chief Hall, your thoughts on that question?
Well, if one were to believe the recent article that was shown on 60 Minutes, where our legislative body in Washington restricted our colleagues in the Drug Enforcement Agency from coming down hard on pill factories and pharmacists and doctors who were prescribing large amount of drugs to individuals. And the gist of the article was this, that basically the pharmaceutical lobby lobbied the Congress and the senators into passing some regulations that hobbled the DEA from doing their job insofar as shutting those places down if they identified pharmaceutical suppliers that were, in other words, selling an overabundance of opiates to a small town in West Virginia, which was the case among others. This is certainly a problem that is like nothing I've ever seen in my lifetime of law enforcement, and it strikes every socioeconomic level that there is. A lot of people don't agree with me, but I've said, you know, when we're dealing with this opiate epidemic, you have one of two choices. You should be in jail or you should be in rehab. My job as a law enforcement officer in your community is to protect your lives and the lives of your family and your children and your friends and relatives. What I've seen with the folks that are addicted to these opiates, they either get clean through rehab or they go to jail, and you're keeping them alive when they're in jail because they probably aren't going to overdose. But what's happening now is we've got people that are mixing up their own concoctions with fentanyl and everything else out there and selling it to your children and to your family. And you know, these just aren't teenage kids we're talking about. The vast majority of people that I know that are users and addicted to that, and some of them started out with legitimate ailment, are anywhere from, you know, 20 to 40, 45 years old. They're not kids. So a very complex problem. I think we got a lot of work to do, but it's not going to be cheap. These folks need monitoring, and the vast majority of these folks don't have a network where they've got somebody that's checking up on them every day and kicking them in the rear end when they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And it's like anything else. If there's nobody taking care of these folks because they can't take care of themselves, they're going to relapse, they're probably going to overdose at some point. And think about that. We're prescribing Narcan to the cops to go out and give to addicts, and now we're giving Narcan to addicts so that if they think they overdosed, their friends can save them. It's insane. And somehow, some way, we need to get a handle on this. And with that, I go back to what I say, jail or rehab. If your kid's in jail, at least you know they're going to be alive next week. If they're in rehab, they're probably going to be alive. If they're out there on the street, they're only one shooting up from being possibly dead by getting a bad bag of dope or something. So no easy answer to it.
Thank you, Chief. Cynthia?
I guess I really think that anyone who wants treatment should be able to get treatment. And I agree with what the chief had said. I think we've made progress in having more treatment available, but we haven't really made it available to everybody. One thing about health insurance changes is that drug rehab is covered in health insurance, and I know that mandates like that are not popular, but I think that's fundamentally a good thing because that is such a big health issue. It's actually affecting life expectancy. I think this is going to take a generation to recover from. I'm sorry to have to tell you, because I think the children now, and they see what's happening to adults, they may not do it. But it may take time for this to go through, because we have created substances that essentially hijack the brain neurology, the physiology, and sort of break your brain. And our capacity to create drugs like this has outstripped the capacity of our bodies to absorb it. And I think the pharmaceutical industries should be held responsible for marketing some of these opiates in an irresponsible way, and the federal government did not stop them, and they should be funding some of the rehab. The heroin pushers and the fentanyl, that's a whole other issue that we struggle with all the time. But I think that this is going to take a long time to recover from, and we're going to have to put our heads down and just slog along. And anybody who thinks there's a magic bullet, I just don't think there is.
Thank you, Representative Browning. Representative Keefe.
I think that was well said, Cynthia. I think talking about it is part of the solution. Bringing this problem out into the light of day is part of the solution. There's a law enforcement component. Probably the toughest day of testimony I heard in the legislature last year on the Human Services Committee was when we heard from two people. One was a mom and one was a sister, and they had both lost a son and respectively a brother to overdoses. and they told the story, and probably many of you in the audience have heard stories or been to funerals, and that is the story, because that story happens every day in Vermont, and it's terrible. It is a terrible, terrible thing. I don't have the answer. I think the governor he appointed Jolinda LeClaire as the sort of to head up this. There's a lot of activity. There's a lot going on. We need to do more, and it's a terrible thing, and we need to talk about it and bring it out into the light of the day.
Okay, so we're running into a bit of a time crunch here. By my watch, it's 8:40, and we have to be out of here at 9. So typically we go for the 5-minute segment with you folks commenting, asking questions on something pertaining to the opioid epidemic. And after that, we were going to go into a 20-minute or so period of general audience commentary. We can sort of just run everything together. That would mean that the chief would escape getting asked his last question on local law enforcement, which I'm sure is going to break his heart. Yeah. But we might be able to kind of wedge that in somehow or another. But anyway, why don't we just start off by going to 5 minutes or so of comment about what additional steps the state can take to combat the opioid epidemic, and hear from whatever you folks might wish to add to that conversation. Looks like there's a hand up over, lady in the red sweater. Is that Sylvia?
I hope I can address this intelligently, because I think it's so obvious. This whole issue of marijuana, entertainment marijuana, not medical marijuana, to legalize it is insane. It's a stepping stone to what you're talking about in terms of other drug use. And we have enough of that. Right now we have enough of a problem with trying to get people from smoking regular cigarettes. So we've got a good thing going there, and now we're going to consider legalizing marijuana, and I think the majority of users smoke it, and smoking's supposed to be a no-no. I don't see the intellectual logic in a lot of the programs that our community and our state and our federal government put forth to the public. And then they want to know why we have these lazy bones around who don't want to work and don't want to be educated or trained so that they can be productive individuals. I think we've got to get a hold on everything, keep things simple, and make our choices important.
Is that Alex?
Hi, I'm Alex Heinz. My question is that I'm not hearing a lot of discussion about the need for more mental health beds in the state, as well as mental health workers. Relative to everything that we're talking about, there is a tremendous need, and as we think about where we need to develop our resource, it really is in mental health providers and mental health beds. We don't see it so much in Manchester. I work in the hospital in Bennington. You want to come to the ER in Bennington with a medical problem, you can't get in because we have so many mental health patients now there. So my question is, and to the folks sitting up there, is what are we doing at the state level to address this problem that is really beginning to hit a crisis point?
Representative Browning?
I think that unfortunately one of the real tragedies here is after Tropical Storm Irene, when the Vermont State Hospital was just damaged and destroyed, we had a chance to redo our mental health system, and what they did is they have relatively small numbers of beds, less than used to be available in the hospital, and the idea that was that you're going to have all this community treatment. Well, the number of beds was insufficient, and the community treatment has not been fully developed. The legislature and the administration at the time ignored the advice of experts because they just thought they could get away with building a smaller facility. So we lost the opportunity to leverage federal funds, FEMA funds, to build a facility that was large enough. So that's water under the bridge. But it shows you the way that the legislature can just decide what it wants to do for political reasons, and they're just going to ignore expert advice because they know what they want to do. And they should have been cautious and careful and provided extra capacity just in case to avoid exactly this situation. Unmet mental health needs are one of the factors in substance abuse of various kinds. So the fact that we have people waiting in the emergency room 6 years after Irene is just a real failure on the part of the legislature, the past legislature and administration. I don't know what the Scott administration is going to recommend. I would recommend building more state beds because I don't think the private hospitals can meet it. At the time when we were building the new acute psychiatric facility in Berlin, I said, let's make it so that we can expand it just in case we need it. And they were like, no, 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 we're not going to need the beds. So we really blew it, and we're going to have to recover for it. And I think we're going to have to spend capital dollars to figure out a way to provide more beds because the situation you described is unacceptable.
So Alex, this isn't exactly to your question because Cynthia, I think, wrapped up that pretty well, and it is an unmet need. But I really think that mental health is something we frankly need to talk about more. We talk about physical health. You know, if I walked in here with my arm in a sling, there'd be all kinds of people say, well, what'd you do? What, you doing all right? Who are you seeing? Which doctor are you going to? There'd be a lot of conversation about physical health. But meanwhile, everyone also has mental health, and we don't even talk about that. And a lot of us are parents, and there's kids in schools, and a lot of these problems can start young, and then before you know it, you're into a remediation problem that's a big challenge. I was at United Counseling Service last week for a meeting with this organization that's got this innovative program really to get people to talk about mental health, to recognize it as a real thing, whether it's you have great mental health or you're not so great mental health, you're having a good day or a bad day. But I think part of it is to talk about mental health in a way that's more normalized and more recognizing that it's different for everybody. That's a different answer than your question, but I wanted to take that opportunity.
Okay, well, why don't we just go to our question and answer session, the general sort of freewheeling moment here. Looks like there's a lady in the back row here who's been dying to ask a question.
Hi, I'm Dee Mirvong. I live in Manchester. And I'd like to take it back to the opioid epidemic that we have in this country. I think it is a country-wide problem. I don't think we're going to solve it here in Vermont. But I would like to hear what we are doing specifically in Vermont to treat people. 114 people died last year in Vermont just of opioid-related death. 62 have died up to July in this year. We track this through the Healthy Vermonters Initiative. And we have monthly and weekly statistics now on how many people are dying of opioids. So I think we need to be much more aggressive in talking about what we're doing to help people in Vermont who are addicted to opioids. Not talk about what caused the problem necessarily all the time, but what we're going to do to solve it here. And I agree with the chief. I think people either should be locked up or in treatment because it's that serious. But most of the people I talk to who have family members who've either died of this or been impacted by this, they can't get into treatment. That is the #1 complaint that I'm hearing. So my question is, what are we doing specifically to improve our treatment options in Vermont? Thank you.
Anyone on the panel like Representative Browning?
I think we've been trying to develop the hub and spoke system that Representative Sullivan referred to, where you have a hub where people come for treatment and then maybe they have outpatient treatment there on a local level. My understanding is that although there still is a substantial waiting list for treatment, which is what you referred to, it is a lot smaller than it used to be. So we are making progress in providing additional treatment beds, but we are not at the point where we should be. And I personally don't know where we're going to get the money and the medical professionals to achieve that, but we have to keep working towards it. I think that we also have something called drug courts. We've been experimenting with drug courts where people who have substance abuse offenses can be essentially sentenced to treatment instead of jail, and if they do well, then their sentence is reduced and so forth. But for a system like that to work, you have to do it really well. You can't just say drug court and that takes care of the problem. So all of these things are really hard. Sometimes people have to go through rehabilitation several times before it works. So it's just really, really hard. And the question of trying to prevent people, to inoculate them against trying this and trying to control the entry of the illegal drugs is something we have to work on as well. So I think we have to keep working on these things. We have been working on it. Governor Shumlin had made the heroin epidemic one of the keynotes of the State of the State in like 2012 or 2013. So we've not been ignoring it, but it is outstripping us. And I think the question of resources, even if we have more money, how do we use it effectively? But the goal of trying to be sure everybody has access to treatment, I think that's a key thing.
You pick, Bob.
A question to Chief Hall. Where do most of the drugs come from that are coming into Manchester? Are they coming through Canada? Are they coming through New York City, Boston? You probably know where they come from.
Well, the primary supply line typically is coming out of New York and Massachusetts, specifically the New York City area and also Springfield, Mass on the western, or excuse me, the eastern side of the state. There's drug availability almost any place, but it's been our experience that the majority of it is coming up from New York City, and some of it comes from Hartford, Connecticut, but it's primarily New York City and out of the Boston, Springfield area for around here. And the DEA actually monitors that quite closely, and they have some pretty good numbers on that, but that's the last numbers that I knew. That's where the primary supplies were coming from.
I think I saw it.
There's been a lot of talk of economic development, and my question is, on the employer side, the state likes to meddle with businesses and increase their costs. There's paid family leave, minimum wages, and other issues. On the employee side, we have an extremely aggressive progressive tax, which is 8.95% at the upper end. And one of the proposals the federal administration is looking at is eliminating the deductibility of state income taxes, which would make us, even more expensive as a state to live in. So how do you reconcile economic growth with those two issues? How do you attract new businesses when you make it expensive for the businesses and expensive for people to live here?
I think that's one of the reasons why I think we need tax reform. I do think it's important to note that the 8.95% is only for income above a certain level. So if somebody's making $1 million a year, they don't pay 8.9% on the whole $1 million. They just pay it on the top amount above a certain level. I understand that. I just wanted to make that clear that there's a progressive system in which you pay a low level on the first certain amount of income, and then it goes up and up as you have more income. It's not 8.95% on all of it. That's one of the reasons I think we should have tax reform. I don't know what they're going to do at the federal level. I think the question of the deductibility is a big issue because it would increase the cost of doing business, and that's why I think we need really aggressive tax reform. But that would mean that people might have to give up some of the things they like in return for lower rates, but I think it would be better overall. Because I think you raised one of the key questions in terms of this struggle between the state trying to have resources to fund economic development, but it doesn't have resources because it doesn't have economic development, and is it actually using the resources it has properly, and I'm not so sure of that.
Well, we're just about out of time, folks. We have 5 minutes left before we have to leave, and we wanted to give the panelists an opportunity to make a closing comment. Originally, it was going to be 2 minutes per person, but We have about 6 minutes left according to my phone here, so maybe can we keep them to 1 minute apiece, perhaps?
Yes.
And I'm going to be kind of mean this time.
Okay.
Mike, would you like to get us started?
Sure. I think a lot of what we talked about tonight revolves around the economics of the state. And from my perspective, I think the fastest way for us to see a significant reduction in the cost of operations in the state would be to start having some accountability on the Department of Human Services. We should be going out, verifying that the people that are on welfare actually live here, because not everybody can live in a post office box. We need to be validating that these people are in fact live, breathing humans and that they live somewhere, and then validate their need for those services. And right now, that's not happening. And we're spending a tremendous amount of money. The fact is, I think that agency is the most expensive agency in the state to run, and nobody's paying attention to where these tax dollars are going. Be a great start. I've always said if you had one welfare fraud investigator in the southern part of the state, central part of the state, and the northern part of the state, they would save the taxpayers their salary and savings just by keeping those minimally criminally intent people honest.
Ding. Okay, Representative Sullivan.
Okay. So pretty much I think on the economic development side, we need to focus on retention and attaining and attracting. So I think we do need to come up with a comprehensive strategy to keep our youth, preserve our essential character of Vermont, and some of that is going to come from increased educational opportunities, encouraging job growth, and affordable housing. That's the retention side. But we also need help from outside. We need to eliminate the anti-business buzz and inject our economy with new, clean industries and entrepreneurs. We need to attract new business that will help us ultimately grow our tax base so we can get rid of this property tax death spiral that we found ourselves in. I think it's going to require investment, monetary investment, and I think we need to find the money and put it to use.
Well done. 58 seconds. All right. Representative
I'd just like to thank you folks for coming out tonight, and thanks GNAT for filming, and Andrew, thank you for moderating, Sharice for being here from the Journal. One of the assets we do have in this community is civic involvement and a pretty strong press, and that's a great thing. One thing we didn't talk about tonight was independent schools. I think that's also a great strength of our region, and one that's under attack. In Montpelier has been under attack, and I think we shouldn't take that for granted, because when we talk about finding ways that we can encourage our economy, there are people that come here because of the independent schools, and they're the ones we want to be here to live and work and raise a family. So don't take that for granted. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Keefe. Representative Browning.
I'll just say that I've tried to provide information on a number of these topics and more at great length in several handouts that are on a table outside. The handouts have my contact information. Feel free to contact me about anything. I also have legislative office hours every Saturday morning from 8 to 9:30 at Chauncey's Restaurant on 7A in Arlington, except Saturday, December 2nd, when I have to go to Montpelier for a legislative caucus. So pick up one of the handouts, or if you don't get one, I can give you my contact information. We were here, we're accountable, we want to hear from you, criticisms, comments, suggestions. We can only do our job when you do your job, which is to come to forums like this and let us know what's on your mind. Thank you.
All right, well, that concludes our forum for tonight. I hope you've enjoyed that. Again, you'll be able to see it again on GNet if you want. I want to say a special thank you to the panelists here. I think they did a great job. And thank you for coming out as well. I hope you found it informative and interesting, and have a good evening.
Thanks.